130 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature recorded on the surface of the Syrian desert in summer. Hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. Hot enough to cause brain damage in under an hour. Hot enough that modern military forces today restrict outdoor operations when temperatures exceed 95 degrees. Roman soldiers marched through 130-degree desert heat. In full armor. Carrying 70 pounds of equipment. And they did it every day for months at a time. And they won. How? The armies they were fighting, the Parthians, the Persians, the desert tribes who had lived in that heat their entire lives, should have had every advantage. These were people who understood desert survival instinctively. Who had spent generations adapting to an environment that kills outsiders within hours. And yet, Roman legions crossed the Syrian desert, the Jordanian plateau, the North African sand seas, and the mountains of Anatolia in summer heat that modern soldiers wouldn't be ordered into. They didn't just survive. They fought at the end of those marches. And won. This was not luck. This was not toughness. This was not Romans being somehow physically superior to heat. This was a system. A precise, obsessively detailed, ruthlessly enforced system that Rome spent centuries perfecting. And when it worked, and it almost always worked, it turned the desert from a killing ground into just another road. Start with the most basic fact about the human body in extreme heat. You sweat. An adult working hard in extreme heat can lose between 1 and 2 liters of water per hour through sweat alone. In 130-degree desert conditions, under physical exertion, carrying heavy equipment, that number goes higher. Lose 2% of your body weight in water and your physical performance drops measurably. Your muscles cramp. Your coordination suffers. Lose 5% and you get headaches, dizziness, and significant cognitive impairment. You start making bad decisions. As a soldier, that will kill you. Lose 10% and your organs begin to fail. Without immediate rehydration, you die. In the Syrian desert in August, a Roman legion of 5,000 men, marching and working, could collectively require somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 liters of water per day. Every day. Without electricity. Without pumps. Without trucks. This was the desert survival problem. Not the heat itself, the water. And Rome solved it before the march even began. Roman military engineers were sent ahead of every desert campaign. Not scouts. Not cavalry. Engineers. Their job was water. Specifically, finding it, securing it, and guaranteeing it would be available at precise intervals along the route before the army moved. The Roman military operated on a standardized march distance. The legion tried to cover between 20 and 25 Roman miles per day. A Roman mile was slightly shorter than a modern mile, roughly 1,480 meters. So roughly 30 to 37 kilometers per day. In that distance, the engineers had to locate, assess, and secure enough water for 5,000 men plus their animals. They used everything. Springs were the priority, mapped, assessed for volume, and marked on route documents. Rivers and streams were obvious choices, but in desert terrain these were often seasonal or unreliable. When natural sources weren't sufficient, which was frequent, Roman engineers dug. The Roman military's ability to identify subsurface water was remarkable. They understood geology, drainage patterns, and the specific plant species that indicated water below the surface. In areas where Roman engineers suspected groundwater, they would sink test wells before the army arrived, assess the volume, and calculate whether it could support a full legion. If it could, marked, secured, defended. If it couldn't, the route was adjusted. The army never moved toward a water source that hadn't been pre-assessed. This single fact, this single discipline, was the foundation of everything else. The timing of the march was not left to individual commanders. It was standardized, enforced, and built entirely around one principle. Do not march in the heat of the day. The Roman desert march began before dawn. The specific timing depended on season and latitude, but the target was to begin moving while the air was still cool, typically around 3 or 4 in the morning. Think about what that means. You are a Roman legionary in Syria in July. Your century rises in the dark. You eat, we'll come back to what specifically, you put on your equipment, and you begin marching in darkness, guided by torches at the front and rear of the column. By the time the sun rises and the temperature begins climbing toward dangerous levels, you have already covered significant ground. The march would typically halt before midday. The soldiers would make camp. Eat the main meal. Rest through the peak heat of the afternoon, the hours between roughly 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon when desert temperatures reached their maximums. In late afternoon, when temperatures began falling, the march could resume for additional distance if the situation required. This schedule was not optional. Officers who pushed their men through midday heat without sufficient cause faced serious consequences. Roman military law understood, with the practical precision of an army that had learned through painful experience, that a legion that marched through peak desert heat would be less effective, more vulnerable to disease, and potentially incapable of fighting at the end of the march. The timing discipline was enforced because results were measurable. A legion that followed the schedule arrived capable of fighting. A legion that sometimes didn't arrive at all. Now the armor question. Because this is the thing that seems impossible. When people imagine Roman soldiers marching in desert heat, they imagine the full lorica segmentata, the iconic segmented plate armor that covers the torso, shoulders, and upper arms. Made of iron strips. Held together with leather straps. Polished and maintained daily. Iron conducts heat extremely efficiently. In direct sunlight, unshaded iron can reach temperatures that cause burns on contact. How did Roman soldiers march in this? The answer involves 3 things that almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. First, the armor didn't usually go on until it was needed. The marching order for a Roman legion in desert conditions typically had the soldiers carrying their armor rather than wearing it. The lorica segmentata could be disassembled into components, bundled together, and carried on the back or on the pack animals that marched with every century. A soldier marching in his tunic and leather subarmalis, the padded undergarment, with his armor bundled and carried rather than worn could regulate his body temperature far more effectively. This isn't guesswork. Multiple Roman military manuals and marching orders from desert campaigns specifically addressed the carrying of armor during marches versus wearing it in formation. Second, the leather subarmalis itself served a dual purpose. It was designed as padding to prevent armor from abrading the skin. But it also acted as a thermal barrier. Heavy wool and leather, while hot, actually insulates against external heat as well as internal cold, the same reason Bedouin desert people traditionally wore heavy layered robes rather than minimal clothing. Blocking radiant heat from the sun is more important than feeling immediately cool. Third, the shields. The massive rectangular scutum shield of the Roman legionary was carried during marches, not held at fighting height. Carried at a specific angle on the left side, it served as a partial shade device, blocking some of the direct sunlight from hitting the body. This wasn't why shields were designed. But Roman soldiers, being practical men who had been doing this for years, understood exactly how to use what they had. The food was not what you would expect. Roman military rations in desert conditions were specifically adjusted from the standard campaign diet. The baseline Roman military ration was built around grain, wheat specifically, issued whole to be ground and prepared by the soldiers themselves each evening. Roughly a kilogram of grain per man per day, providing approximately 3,000 calories, the energy requirement for sustained physical activity. In desert conditions, this baseline remained because grain was shelf-stable in heat in ways that other foods were not. Meat, vegetables, fresh bread, these spoiled quickly in extreme heat, sometimes within hours. But the desert ration added something critical. Salt. Romans understood, through centuries of practical experience, that soldiers sweating heavily needed to replace not just water but the minerals lost through sweat. The daily salt ration increased significantly in desert conditions. Soldiers were sometimes issued salt tablets, or encouraged to add additional salt to their water, specifically to prevent the cramping and collapse that comes from hyponatremia. The dangerous loss of sodium that can kill even a hydrated person if they've been sweating heavily. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, the salt ration or salt payment given to Roman soldiers. Salt was so critical to military function in desert conditions that it was literally a form of compensation. The Romans also consumed posca, that mixture of water and sour wine vinegar we discussed in the logistics video. In desert conditions, posca was consumed in much larger quantities than in temperate climates. The vinegar served multiple purposes. It made water safer to drink when water quality was uncertain. It replaced electrolytes lost through sweat. And it had a cooling subjective effect. The sharpness of the vinegar on the tongue and throat created a sensation of refreshment even when the liquid itself was warm. Roman soldiers in the Syrian desert drank a lot of posca. Warm posca from a leather flask that had been on their back all morning. And they were grateful for it. Here is what it actually felt like. You are a Roman legionary. Gaius, let's say, from a village near Rome. 22 years old. 3 years into your service. You have marched in the rain in Germania and the cold in Britannia, and now you are in Syria in August, and you understand, viscerally, that this is a different kind of hard. The march begins at 3 in the morning. You haven't fully slept, the desert at night is not quiet. The temperature drops dramatically after dark in the desert, which sounds good until you realize you've been sweating all day and now you're lying on the ground in damp wool and the temperature is 60 degrees and the wind is coming from the north and you are somehow both sunburned and cold. You eat before marching. Grain porridge with salt and olive oil, prepared by your section the previous evening. It tastes like nothing because everything has tasted like nothing for 6 weeks. But you eat it, because you know what happens to men who don't eat. The march starts and the darkness is almost a relief. The stars in the Syrian desert are extraordinary. You've noticed this, Gaius, in the quiet moments before dawn when you're not thinking about your feet or your pack weight or the water situation. The stars are genuinely beautiful and you haven't told anyone you noticed. By sunrise you've covered 15 kilometers. The light comes up and with it the heat begins, not immediately crushing but building steadily, the way a fire builds when it catches well. By 9 in the morning the heat is a physical presence. Not a temperature, a weight. You can feel it pressing on the top of your helmet, on the back of your neck, on your shoulders through your tunic. Your water flask is 1/3 empty. You know there is a spring ahead, marked, assessed, enough for the whole century, but the knowledge doesn't make the back of your throat any less dry. By 10 you stop. The tent goes up. It's not much, a leather tent shared between 8 men, barely large enough to lie down in, providing shade more than comfort. You drink. More posca, warm now from the flask. You eat a small portion of bread, unleavened, hard, requiring real chewing. You lie down in the tent shade and the temperature inside is still above 100 degrees, but it is shade and shade is everything. Some men sleep. You don't, quite. You drift in the specific discomfort of a body that is too hot to fully rest and too tired to stay fully awake. 4 hours pass this way. Then the afternoon begins. The consequences of system failure were precise and documented. A legion that exhausted its water reserves between marked sources didn't just suffer individual casualties. It collapsed. Ancient sources describe several instances where Roman forces, either through poor planning, unexpected route changes, or underestimated route changes, or underestimated consumption, found themselves without sufficient water in desert conditions. The progression was always the same. First the animals died. Pack mules and horses were more vulnerable to dehydration than humans. When the animals began dying, it stripped the legion of its ability to carry supplies and equipment. Soldiers had to shoulder burdens they weren't designed to carry on top of already extreme physical stress. Then the rear of the column began falling behind. Older soldiers. Soldiers who had been slightly sick. Soldiers who had pushed themselves slightly harder the previous day. Then the center softened. Marcus Crassus, the wealthy Roman who made the catastrophic decision to invade Parthia in 53 BC, provides history's most brutal case study in what happens when Roman desert logistics broke down. His campaign failed for multiple reasons, but water management and supply discipline were critical factors. The army that lost catastrophically at Carrhae was an army that had been pushed too hard in heat, without sufficient logistical preparation, by a commander who understood money and politics better than he understood the desert. 53,000 Roman soldiers went east with Crassus. Fewer than 10,000 came back. The desert didn't need to kill them directly. It just needed to weaken them enough that the Parthians could finish the work. This was understood by every competent Roman commander who came after. Logistics first. Always logistics first. How did this compare to the armies Rome was fighting? The Parthians, the Persians, the various desert peoples Rome encountered in the east and south, these were not unprepared for desert warfare. Far from it. They had generations of cultural knowledge about desert survival embedded in their tactics, their equipment, their food culture, their timing. In many individual respects, a Parthian nomadic cavalry rider was better adapted to desert conditions than a Roman legionary. He wore lighter clothing, rode rather than walked, carried less equipment, and had been learning desert survival from childhood. So how did Rome compete? Scale. A Parthian cavalry force of 1,000 men could be supplied and watered with relative ease from local sources. Rome could supply, water, and maintain the fighting effectiveness of 5,000 to 10,000 men across weeks-long campaigns in the same terrain. The engineering infrastructure, the pre-assessed water sources, the standardized march timing, the supply depot system, meant that Rome could project military force into desert environments at a scale that local powers simply couldn't match. It wasn't that individual Roman soldiers were tougher or better adapted than individual desert warriors. It was that the Roman system could support an army in the desert. And a system that supports an army beats an army of individual warriors almost every time. The other thing Rome had was standardization. Every legionary across the entire empire followed the same march discipline, the same water protocols, the same ration adjustments. This meant that a commander who moved his legion from the Rhine to the Syrian desert was leading men who already knew the desert protocols, because the protocols were universal and had been drilled into every soldier regardless of where they were stationed. Desert survival in the Roman army wasn't specialized knowledge. It was basic training. By the time a Roman soldier completed his 25 years of service, he had the desert protocols so deep in his body that they were automatic. Wake before dawn. Drink posca. March in the dark. Stop before midday. Rest. March in the late afternoon. Assess the water. Mark the route. Enforce the timing. Not because he was told to in that specific moment. Because that was what soldiers did. That was what the system demanded. And the system had been proven, repeatedly and brutally, to be the difference between armies that came home and armies that didn't. This was not about individual toughness. The soldiers who marched through the Syrian desert in August weren't tougher than the men they were fighting. They were better organized. They followed a system developed over centuries by an institution that had learned, through painful experience and genuine intellectual effort, exactly what the human body needed to function in extreme heat. They understood hydration before the word existed. They understood electrolyte replacement before chemistry could explain it. They understood the relationship between timing, rest, food, and performance with a precision that modern sports science has only recently caught up with. Rome didn't conquer the desert. Rome understood it. And then Rome turned that understanding into a system that any soldier anywhere in the empire could follow. That is why they survived. That is why they won. Here's what I want you to think about. The Roman soldier marching before dawn through the Syrian desert didn't know about electrolytes. He didn't know about hyponatremia. He didn't have the scientific vocabulary to explain why posca worked or why the timing of the march mattered. He just knew that this was how you did it. Because that was the system. And the system worked. How many things in your own life work the same way? You follow a process that was figured out by someone who came before you, without necessarily understanding why, and the process delivers results because the understanding is already built in. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see what happened when Roman soldiers faced the opposite extreme, the frozen forests of Germania, where an entirely different survival system was needed, and where that system catastrophically failed at one of Rome's worst military disasters.